Grenada, 1983. The jungle screamed. Bullets tore through palm fronds like angry hornets, shredding the air, where Lieutenant Nathaniel Garrett's head had been 3 seconds earlier. 27 years old, lean as a wolf, he pressed his body against the scorched earth of St. George's, while tracer rounds painted red lines through the Caribbean darkness above him. 12 American medical students. 48 hours in captivity, zero margin for error. Garrett's fingers found the radio switch without looking. Muscle memory, the kind that saves lives when thinking takes too long. Vanguard 1 to Overwatch. Tangos converging. Need immediate extraction for civilians. My position will not hold. Static crackled. Then a voice that sounded like gravel in a coffee can. Negative Vanguard. Weather's turned. Birds are grounded. You hold until dawn or you don't hold at all. Dawn was 4 hours away. Garrett looked back at the medical students huddled in the ravaged basement behind him. Kids, really. 20 years old, maybe 22. Eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes when you realize the world is nothing like the brochure promised. One girl, blonde, couldn't have been more than 19, clutched a blood-soaked textbook like it was a Bible. She met his eyes. Are we going to die here? Garrett checked his magazine. 17 rounds. He had 4 more mags. 68 bullets between 12 civilians and whatever hell was coming through that tree line. Not today, he said. What happened next would earn him a chest full of medals he'd never wear in public, and a mark on his body he'd carry to his grave. What happened next would create a legend that would sleep for 42 years before waking up in the last place anyone expected. But that was then. Fort Wainwright, Alaska. Present day. The mess hall at Fort Wainwright smelled like every military dining facility in America. Industrial cleaner fighting a losing battle against decades of fried food and stale coffee. 200 soldiers packed the space on this Friday evening, their voices creating a wall of sound that bounced off cinder block walls and government-issue linoleum. In the corner booth near the emergency exit, partially hidden behind a 20-year-old issue of Army Times, sat a man the other soldiers didn't notice. 70 years had carved deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair the color of winter steel, but his posture remained parade ground straight. He wore civilian clothes, worn jeans, a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, work boots with the leather cracked and honest. Brigadier General Nathaniel Garrett, retired, sipped coffee that tasted like motor oil and watched. The small spiral notebook beside his cup contained 3 weeks of observations. Times, names, behavioral patterns, the kind of intelligence work that didn't involve satellites or encrypted communications, just patience and the ability to see what others missed. Tonight would be different. He could feel it the way old wounds ache before a storm. The mess hall doors opened. Every head in the room turned toward the sound, some ancient instinct drawing eyes to movement, to the new, to the potentially dangerous. What they saw made 200 conversations stutter and stop like a record player unplugged mid-song. A woman stood in the doorway, small, maybe 5'4" in her scuffed combat boots, oversized olive green hoodie hanging off narrow shoulders like she'd borrowed it from someone twice her size. Blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, loose strands framing features that belonged on a college campus, not a military installation. Slim-fit jeans that screamed civilian, a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. She looked lost. She looked young. She looked like prey. Staff Sergeant Brock Halverson was the first to move. 6'3" of muscle and scar tissue earned across 2 tours in Afghanistan, he unfolded from his table with the slow, deliberate menace of a man who'd learned that intimidation was cheaper than violence, but just as effective. Well, 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 his voice carried across the suddenly quiet space. Somebody's Instagram model took a wrong turn. Laughter erupted, sharp, immediate, the kind that comes when a group smells blood. The woman, she couldn't have been more than 27, 28, stood perfectly still. Her eyes, startlingly blue, even from across the room, dropped to the floor. Her shoulders hunched forward. Small hands clutched the straps of her backpack until her knuckles went white. Everything about her body language screamed fear. Everything except the way she breathed. Garrett noticed. 3 weeks of observation had taught him to notice everything. Her breathing remained steady, controlled the measured rhythm of someone managing adrenaline rather than succumbing to it. And her feet, despite the apparent trembling in her hands, had shifted into a balanced stance, weight distributed, perfectly ready to move in any direction. Interesting. Brock took 3 steps closer, playing to his audience now. Seriously, sweetheart, the costume party is probably at the community center downtown. This is a federal military installation. You need proper authorization to be here. More laughter. Cell phones materialized in hands like magic tricks. The digital age had turned humiliation into entertainment and entertainment into currency. This was going to be viral content. This was going to be legend. First Lieutenant Sloan Murdoch rose from her seat near the serving line. 30 years old, 5'8", dark hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She'd spent 5 years as the only female officer at Fort Wainwright. 5 years of proving herself twice as hard for half the recognition. 5 years of learning that the only way to survive was to be harder than the men, meaner than the circumstances, and absolutely ruthless with anyone who might be seen as weak. She circled the small woman like a shark scenting wounded prey. "Oh my God," Sloane's voice dripped theatrical concern. "Honey, are you lost? Because this is really not where you want to be. Trust me on this." The watching soldiers leaned forward despite themselves. There was something magnetic about cruelty, something that drew the eye even as it repulsed the conscience. The young woman's voice emerged barely above a whisper. I, I have orders to report here." "Orders?" Brock's laugh could have cut glass. "From who? Your yoga instructor, your life coach?" He gestured broadly to his audience, a performer who knew his crowd. "Look at this, people. We've got ourselves a lost little Instagram influencer playing dress-up in daddy's hoodie." The mockery should have been devastating. Any normal person would have fled by now, tears streaming, dignity in tatters. But the woman simply stood there, absorbing each insult with an unnatural stillness that only someone trained to notice would recognize as tactical patience. Private First Class Garrett Thorne felt something twist uncomfortably in his gut as he watched the scene unfold. 21 years old, fresh out of basic training, he'd enlisted against his father's wishes and his mother's tears for one reason: to find his sister. Kira had vanished 3 years ago. Not missing, her letters had come sporadically, always from different locations, always maddeningly vague. "I'm okay. I'm serving. I can't say more. I love you." 3 years of watching their parents age a decade from worry. 3 years of lying awake wondering if she was alive, dead, or something worse. And now watching this woman being systematically humiliated by people who should have known better, Garrett felt his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory. Grady Thorne, who'd carried a rifle through the Ardennes in 1944 and came home with frostbitten feet and a philosophy about manhood that had nothing to do with dominance and everything to do with protection. "A real man," Grady had said, whiskey-voiced and iron-eyed on his deathbed, "protects people who can't protect themselves. That's it. That's the whole job." Garrett stood up. His voice came out younger than he wanted, but steady. "Maybe we should just leave her alone." The room's attention swiveled toward him like a spotlight, and Garrett felt 200 pairs of eyes calculate his value and find him wanting. Brock's smile turned predatory. "What was that, Private?" "I said maybe we should leave her alone, Sergeant." Garrett's voice gained strength from repetition. "She's not bothering anyone." "Oh." Sloane's voice could have frozen nitrogen. "The baby private's got a crush on our little dress-up doll. How precious." The laughter that followed had teeth in it now. Mockery had found a new target, and the crowd's hunger shifted accordingly. But then Corporal Daniel Hayes decided to escalate things from mockery to challenge. A weapons specialist with arms like bridge cables and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite with a dull chisel. He stood and moved toward the young woman with the casual confidence of someone who'd never lost a fight. "Hey, Princess." His voice carried parade ground authority. "You're wearing what looks like military gear. So let's see if you know basic drill commands. You know what those are, right?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Hayes expected hesitation, confusion, maybe tears. What he got instead made him take an involuntary step backward. "Yes, Corporal." The young woman's voice emerged crisp and clear, cutting through the background noise like a blade through silk. She snapped to attention with movements so precise, so perfectly executed, that the laughter began to falter. Her posture transformed from cowering civilian to textbook military bearing in the space of a heartbeat. Spine straight, shoulders back, chin level, eyes forward, every angle perfect. In his corner, Garrett the general, not the private, set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. His hand didn't shake, but it wanted to. Hayes recovered his confidence and pressed forward. "About face." The woman executed the movement flawlessly. Her boots clicked against the linoleum with parade ground precision. The timing was perfect, the execution without flaw. Muscle memory operating at a level that took months, sometimes years, to develop. The casual chatter in the mess hall began to die as more soldiers noticed something wasn't quite right about this supposedly helpless civilian. "Present arms," Hayes commanded, certain he could trip her up. Without hesitation, she brought her hands up in the exact position required for presenting an imaginary rifle. Her form was so perfect it could have been used in a training manual. The kind of precision that spoke of endless repetition under the watchful eyes of instructors who accepted nothing less than perfection. Brock sensed the shift in atmosphere and moved quickly to regain control. "Lucky guess," he announced loudly, his voice carrying forced confidence. "Anyone can memorize a few moves from YouTube videos, but let's see how you handle real equipment." He unholstered his sidearm, a standard-issue M9 Beretta, and made a show of ejecting the magazine and clearing the chamber with theatrical flair before extending the empty weapon toward her. "Field strip and reassemble. 30 seconds. Standard qualification procedure." It was meant to be impossible. Military weapons were complex precision instruments that took months of training to handle competently. No civilian could possibly. The woman's hands moved. Not fast, not slow, liquid. Like water finding its level, like mercury flowing across glass. The weapon came apart in her grasp with a series of soft clicks, mechanical whispers that spoke of absolute familiarity. Spring, barrel, slide, frame, each component removed with surgical precision and laid out in perfect order on the nearby table. The watching soldiers leaned forward despite themselves caught between disbelief and growing unease. 15 seconds. That was all it had taken her to completely disassemble a service pistol that many of them still struggled with after months of training. The reassembly was poetry. Her fingers moved without conscious thought, muscle memory guiding each motion as the weapon reformed in her hands. Click, snap, slide. In 12 seconds, the pistol was whole again, the action smooth as silk as she tested the mechanism before safely returning it to Brock. Total time 27 seconds. The silence that followed was deafening. Brock stared at the weapon in his hands as if it might bite him. His confident smirk had been replaced by something approaching confusion. Sloane's mouth had fallen open, her practiced superiority momentarily shattered. Hayes was frantically trying to remember if he'd ever seen anyone, including instructors, handle a weapon with that level of effortless competence. "Beginner's luck," Brock said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Anyone can take apart a pistol if they've practiced enough." The woman said nothing. She simply returned to her previous position, hands clasped behind her back, eyes downcast as if the last 30 seconds had never happened. But Garrett had seen enough. The retired general, not the young private. 3 weeks of surveillance, 42 years of experience, and every instinct developed across 3 wars told him the same thing. This woman was not what she appeared to be. He reached for the encrypted phone in his jacket pocket. Not the smartphone the younger generation carried, but a modified satellite unit that connected to networks most people didn't know existed. His arthritic fingers found the keys from memory and composed a brief message to handlers who operated in shadows deeper than military intelligence. Target demonstrating advanced capabilities. Request immediate analysis. The response came back in less than 30 seconds. Continue observation. Do not intervene. Garrett settled back into his booth and watched the trap continue to close. Colonel Marcus Drummond chose that moment to enter the mess hall. 63 years old, weathered face scanning the room with the automatic assessment of a career officer who'd made life or death decisions for 40 years. He immediately noticed the crowd formation, the cell phones, the palpable tension radiating from the center of the room like heat from a fire. "What's the situation here?" Drummond's voice cut through the noise like a blade carrying 3 decades of command authority. Brock snapped to attention, but his smile remained confident. "Just conducting an impromptu inspection, sir. Checking to make sure personnel are properly authorized to wear military-affiliated clothing on base." Drummond's gaze moved to the young woman, taking in her oversized hoodie, her civilian jeans, her obvious discomfort. To his experienced eyes, she looked like exactly what Brock claimed, a confused civilian who'd somehow ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Ma'am?" Drummond's voice wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of official inquiry. "Do you have proper authorization to be on this installation?" The woman reached into her hoodie pocket with movements so careful they seemed choreographed. She produced a slightly crumpled manila envelope and extracted a set of papers that looked official enough to pass initial inspection. "Yes, sir. Orders to report for temporary duty assignment." Drummond accepted the documents, his expression growing increasingly puzzled as he read. The orders appeared legitimate, bearing all the correct signatures and authorization codes, but something about them seemed off. The assignment details were vague, the reporting structure unclear. Classification markers that referenced programs Drummond had never heard of despite 40 years in service. "These orders are unusual." Drummond said slowly, his military mind automatically flagging inconsistencies. The authorization codes are correct, but the assignment parameters are classified above my clearance level. For the first time since entering the room, the woman looked up. Her blue eyes met Drummond's with a directness that seemed to contradict her submissive posture. Yes, sir. That was all she said. 2 words. But something in those 2 words made the hair on the back of Drummond's neck stand up. Brock's confidence flickered for the first time. In his experience, confused civilians didn't carry classified military orders with authorization codes that stumped full colonels. Sir, Sloan interjected, sensing Brock's uncertainty and moving to support her superior. With respect, those documents could be forgeries. Identity theft is a serious problem these days, and military credentials are valuable on the black market. It was a reasonable concern, and Drummond nodded slowly. Ma'am, I'm going to need to verify these orders through proper channels. Until then, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to remain here under supervision. The woman simply nodded, her compliance so complete it seemed almost rehearsed. But Private Garrett Thorne noticed something the others missed. The way her eyes moved as Drummond spoke, cataloging the positions of every person in the room, calculating angles and distances with unconscious precision. The same way his sister used to map out basketball courts before games, seeing the whole field of play before the whistle blew. The thought hit him like cold water. What if, in the meantime, Brock said, seizing the opportunity to regain control of the situation, maybe our guest wouldn't mind demonstrating some more of those impressive skills she showed us earlier. His voice carried a dangerous edge now, the tone of someone who'd decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. Hayes stepped forward, producing his own sidearm. How about we move up to something more complex, the M1911.45 ACP. Different weapon system. Older design, trickier to handle. He gestured toward a glass case on the mess hall wall where several historical weapons were displayed. The M1911 had been standard military issue from 1911 through the 1980s, a design that had served American soldiers through 2 world wars, Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. That's not necessary, Drummond began. But Brock was already moving toward the case, his squad falling in behind him with the coordinated movement of a pack that had caught the scent of blood. Oh, but I think it is necessary, sir. Brock's voice remained respectful to Drummond, but carried an undertone that suggested he would not be deterred. If this woman is going to be on our base, we need to ensure she meets our standards. It's a matter of unit integrity. The logic was sound enough to make Drummond hesitate. Unit integrity was indeed sacred in military culture, and Brock's concerns, while aggressively presented, weren't entirely unreasonable. Hayes retrieved the M1911 from the display case, cleared it with practiced efficiency, and handed it to the young woman. The weapon was heavier than modern pistols, all steel in history, the kind of firearm that demanded respect and skill in equal measure. 27 seconds, Brock announced, consulting his watch with theatrical precision. That's the current base record for complete disassembly and reassembly. Set in 1985 by, he squinted at the record board, N. Garrett, some old-timer from back in the day. In his corner booth, the old-timer in question felt 40 years fall away in an instant. That record, that weapon, that day. He'd been 33 years old, just back from a classified operation in Central America, and the base armor had bet him $50 he couldn't beat the standing record. He'd won the $50, and now 40 years later, he was about to watch his record either stand or fall. The young woman approached the weapon table with measured steps. Her small hands reached for the M1911, with movements that seemed almost reluctant, as if she understood the weight of what she was about to do. She lifted the .45 with both hands, checking the chamber and confirming the weapon was safe with movements so automatic they seemed unconscious. Her fingers found the takedown mechanisms and the familiar ritual began. Slide stop, barrel bushing, recoil spring, each component extracted with mechanical precision. The disassembly flowed like a carefully choreographed dance, each movement precise and economical. The crowd grew quiet as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't luck. This wasn't YouTube knowledge. This was the kind of fluid certainty that spoke of thousands of repetitions, muscle memory, so deeply ingrained that conscious thought was unnecessary. 11 seconds for complete disassembly. The reassembly was faster still. Components flowed together as if magnetized, each part finding its proper place without hesitation or adjustment. The final pieces snapped home with sounds like closing doors, and she stepped back from the fully assembled weapon. Brock stared at his stopwatch as if it had personally betrayed him. Total time 22 seconds. A new base record. Drummond stepped forward, his experienced eye examining the weapon she'd assembled. Every component was in perfect position. The action was smooth as silk when he tested it. This wasn't luck or memorization. This was the kind of competence that came from intensive professional training. Where did you learn to do that? Drummond asked quietly, his voice carrying a weight that suggested the answer might be more important than anyone realized. The woman's response was barely audible, delivered to the floor rather than to her questioner. Practice, sir. But the word hung in the air with implications that made experienced soldiers shift uncomfortably. What kind of practice produced this level of skill? What kind of training created capabilities that exceeded those of career military personnel? Brock's psychological need for dominance was fracturing now, the carefully constructed narrative of superior dealing with inferior beginning to crumble in the face of evidence he couldn't explain away. But rather than backing down, his pride demanded escalation. Neat trick, he said, his voice carrying forced casualness that fooled no one. But handling weapons is only part of being a soldier. Let's see how you do with some real military knowledge. He began firing questions in rapid succession, each one designed to expose supposed civilian ignorance. What's the effective range of an M4 carbine? 550 meters, point target, 600 meters, area target, she replied without hesitation. Standard combat load for a Navy corpsman. 4 fluids trauma bandages, morphine auto-injectors, quick clot, hemostatic agents, nasopharyngeal airways, chest seals. How do you call for close air support in a danger close situation? Authentication with higher command, precise target coordinates using military grid reference system, complete personnel accountability within blast radius, confirmation of friendlies' positions and marking. Danger close protocol requires approval from ground commander and air controller. The questions came like machine gun fire, each one technical enough to stump most civilians and many soldiers. But she answered them all, her responses crisp and precise, delivered with a kind of casual confidence that suggested the information was so basic it hardly required conscious thought. Sloan found herself taking notes, trying to remember information that this woman rattled off without apparent effort. Private Garrett Thorne felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The way she stood, the way she moved, that slight tilt of her head when she concentrated. He'd seen it 1,000 times growing up, watching his sister study, watching her prepare, watching her transform from his goofy older sister into something focused and dangerous on the basketball court. No, it couldn't be. Could it? Hayes decided to try a different approach, pulling out his smartphone and accessing a military training database. Okay, let's try some current tactical scenarios. You're pinned down by sniper fire from an elevated position. Your squad is taking casualties. How do you respond? It was a complex scenario that required understanding of advanced tactical principles, the kind of question used in staff college examinations. The woman didn't hesitate. Identify sniper position through muzzle flash triangulation and impact analysis. Deploy smoke for concealment while moving casualties to hard cover. Establish suppressive fire with squad automatic weapons to fix the sniper in position. Call for counter-sniper support or close air support depending on available assets. If neither available, coordinate flanking maneuver using available terrain while maintaining base of fire. Priority is casualty extraction, not engagement. The answer was textbook perfect, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had faced exactly this scenario in real combat conditions. Hayes found himself nodding along, recognizing sound tactical thinking, even as he wondered where a supposed civilian could have learned such advanced concepts. Drummond felt the situation shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. His military instincts were screaming warnings, but he couldn't quite identify the source of his concern. The woman standing before him looked harmless enough, yet she had just demonstrated weapons proficiency that exceeded most of his seasoned soldiers and tactical knowledge that belonged in advanced military studies. Let's try field medicine, Sloan suggested, pulling a first aid kit from behind the serving counter. Any real soldier should know basic trauma care. She selected a complex trauma scenario, the kind that would challenge even trained medics. Soldier takes shrapnel to the thigh, severing the femoral artery. He's conscious but losing blood fast. You've got maybe 3 minutes before he bleeds out. What do you do? It was a brutal scenario, one that required not just theoretical knowledge, but the kind of calm precision that came from seeing real combat wounds. The woman moved with the fluid efficiency of an emergency room surgeon. Control bleeding with direct pressure proximal to the wound. She began, her hands demonstrating each procedure on an imaginary patient with movements so precise they seemed choreographed. Apply tourniquet 2 inches above injury site, tighten until distal pulse disappears. Mark time of application on patient's forehead. Treat for shock, elevate legs, maintain body temperature. Establish IV access if qualified. Administer fluid replacement. Prepare for emergency evacuation. Document all interventions. She paused, then added with clinical precision, time to pulse stopped approximately 45 seconds. Patient stabilized for transport. Survival probability 85% with immediate evacuation. The performance was flawless, executed with a level of skill that would have impressed military medics with years of field experience. Sloan stared, her mind struggling to process what she just witnessed. Private Thorne watched the woman's hands as she demonstrated the medical procedures, and his heart stopped. There, on her left wrist, partially hidden by her sleeve but visible when she moved. A scar, shaped like a crescent moon, maybe an inch long. The same scar his sister had gotten when she was 12 years old, falling off her bike trying to impress a boy named Kevin Martinez. The same scar he'd helped bandage while she tried not to cry. The same scar that had faded over the years but never quite disappeared. Kira. The word escaped his lips before he could stop it. 200 heads turned toward him, but the woman's reaction was what mattered. For just a fraction of a second, a blink, a heartbeat. Her eyes flicked to his face, and in that instant, before her mask of submission reasserted itself, Private Garrett Thorne saw his sister looking back at him. Recognition. Warning. A silent message that screamed, "Not yet." Brock sensed the situation slipping away from him entirely. His carefully constructed narrative was crumbling in the face of evidence he couldn't explain or dismiss. But rather than accepting defeat, his psychological makeup demanded one final escalation. "Interesting skills for a civilian," he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Makes me wonder where someone picks up that kind of training. Private contractors, off-the-books operations, maybe somewhere even less official." The implications were clear, and Drummond felt his concern ratcheting up another notch. Brock was essentially accusing this woman of being some kind of covert operative. "Sergeant," Drummond warned, "you're heading into territory that requires more than speculation." But Brock was beyond listening to warnings. His need to maintain dominance was overriding his better judgment. "Sir, with respect, we have an unidentified individual with advanced combat training on our base carrying questionable orders and demonstrating skills that most of our own soldiers don't possess. At what point do we start asking harder questions? At what point do we ensure she's not a security risk?" He turned to the woman, and his next words would change everything. "I think it's time for a more thorough inspection. Strip search procedures. Standard security protocol for suspicious individuals. We need to make sure our guest isn't carrying anything that might be dangerous to base security." The words hit the mess hall like a physical blow. Drummond's face darkened with anger. "Sergeant, you are way out of line." "Am I, sir?" Brock replied, his tone respectful but carrying an undertone of challenge. "We have an unidentified individual with advanced combat training, questionable credentials, and demonstrated weapons proficiency. Standard security procedures exist for exactly this situation." Sloan stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to support Brock while positioning herself as the voice of female solidarity. "I could conduct the search, sir. Keep it professional. Make sure there are no irregularities." The offer was made with false concern, but the malicious anticipation in her eyes was unmistakable. Private Thorne felt something twist in his stomach as he realized where this was heading. "Sir, this isn't necessary. She's cooperated with everything." "Private Thorne," Brock said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "you seem to have strong opinions about security procedures. Perhaps you'd like to explain to the colonel why you think protocol should be ignored." It was a direct challenge to Garrett's military career, delivered with calculated precision. Drummond opened his mouth to shut this down to reassert his authority, but the woman's voice cut through the tension with unexpected clarity. "It's fine." 2 words, quiet, calm, delivered with such complete acceptance that they seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Every eye in the room turned to her. "If Sergeant Halverson believes a search is necessary for base security," she continued, her voice steady and clear, "I'll comply with standard procedures." The words were spoken with such calm acceptance that they seemed almost rehearsed. But something in her tone suggested this capitulation wasn't defeat. It was a choice. Brock's face lit up with predatory satisfaction. "Outstanding. Lieutenant Murdoch, conduct the search. Make it thorough." But in his corner booth, General Nathaniel Garrett felt every instinct developed across 42 years of military service suddenly scream in warning. He'd seen this before, the calm before violence, the stillness that preceded the storm. He looked at the woman, really looked at her, and saw what everyone else had missed. Her body language remained submissive, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. The perfect picture of defeat. But her breathing had changed. the measured, controlled rhythm of someone preparing for action. And her feet, despite the apparent surrender, had shifted into a perfect combat stance. Weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. Garrett reached for his phone to send another message, but the response from his handlers came through before he could type. Do not intervene under any circumstances. This is her operation. Her operation. The woman's hands moved to the hem of her oversized hoodie. Brock's smile widened with anticipation. Sloan stepped forward with eager satisfaction. 200 soldiers pressed closer with their phones, recording everyone anticipating the moment when the pretense would finally be stripped away. But Private Garrett Thorne, watching his sister's face, saw something that made his blood run cold. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. The hoodie began to rise, revealing first the toned muscles of her abdomen, then the defined lines of someone whose physical conditioning went far beyond civilian fitness standards. She was wearing a black tank top underneath, form-fitting and practical. But it was what lay beyond, what began to emerge as the fabric lifted higher, that would transform every assumption in the room. Ink, black as midnight, beginning to show at the small of her back. Intricate lines that spoke of professional artistry, of hours spent under the needle of something that was part art, part declaration, part warning. The woman, Lieutenant Kira Thorne, though no one except her brother knew, it yet pulled the hoodie off completely and stood in her tank top and jeans. And there, covering her entire back from shoulder blade to shoulder blade, from the base of her neck to her lower spine, was a masterpiece that made 200 soldiers forget to breathe. A dragon. Not the cartoonish representations popular in civilian tattoo parlors, but something rendered with such artistic precision and anatomical accuracy that it seemed alive. The creature was coiled in a perfect spiral, scales, individually detailed claws sharp enough to seem real, eyes burning with an intensity that made the artwork seem three-dimensional. But it wasn't just any dragon. It was a specific design, a particular style, a symbol that existed in only one context known to only a handful of people in the entire United States military. In his corner booth, General Nathaniel Garrett stood up for the first time in 3 weeks. His hand moved to his left forearm, where 42 years ago a military tattoo artist in a secured facility in North Carolina had marked him with an identical design. His was faded now, the black ink turned gray with age and sun exposure, the details softened by time and countless missions. But it was the same dragon, the same crest, the same mark that had been given to only 47 people in 42 years of secret operations, 34 of whom were dead. Private Garrett Thorne's whisper cut through the silence like a blade. Holy God, that's the dragon crest. And just like that, everything changed. The silence that followed Private Thorne's words was the kind that precedes earthquakes, the kind that happens when the world pauses between what was and what will be, when reality holds its breath before shattering into something unrecognizable. 200 soldiers stood, frozen, phones still recording, mouths still open, brains still trying to process what their eyes were showing them, but their minds couldn't accept. The dragon crest. Even those who didn't know the name knew the symbol. Knew it the way you know a shark's fin in water or a rattlesnake's coil in grass. Some knowledge lives deeper than conscious thought, written into the survival instincts that kept humanity alive when the world was nothing but teeth and darkness. Staff Sergeant Brock Halverson's face had gone the color of old newsprint. His hands, which moments ago had been steady with anticipated triumph, now trembled like leaves in a storm. The psychological architecture he'd built his entire adult life around dominance, through intimidation, respect, through fear, manhood, through control, collapsed in the space between heartbeats. Because the dragon crest meant one thing and one thing only. Elite didn't begin to cover it. Lieutenant Kira Thorne stood perfectly still, her back to the crowd, the dragon seeming to move in the flickering fluorescent lights. The tattoo covered every inch of skin from her shoulder blades to the small of her back, rendered in black so deep they seemed to absorb light itself. But what made it truly remarkable were the details that only became visible upon close inspection. Woven into the dragon's coils were coordinates rendered in such small script they were barely legible. Numbers that meant nothing to most people, but everything to those who knew 12.0 degrees north, 61.7 degrees west. The exact location of Point Salines and Airfield, Grenada, where the Dragon Crest program had begun 42 years ago. The dragon's eyes were the most unsettling part. They seemed to follow the viewer tracking movement with an intelligence that shouldn't have been possible in ink and flesh. Ancient, knowing, merciless. Private First Class Garrett Thorne took 3 steps forward before he even realized he was moving. His voice came out hoarse, fractured by 3 years of wondering and worrying and waking up at night from dreams where his sister was calling for help he couldn't provide. Kira, she turned slowly, deliberately, and for the first time since entering the mess hall, Lieutenant Kira Thorne allowed her mask to drop completely. The submissive posture evaporated like morning fog. Her shoulders rolled back to military bearing that could have graced a recruiting poster. Her spine straightened to parade ground perfection. Her eyes, those startling blue eyes that had seemed so vulnerable and lost, now carried the weight of someone who had made decisions that ended lives and saved nations. When she spoke, her voice had transformed. No longer the whisper of a frightened civilian, but the clear, measured tones of someone accustomed to giving orders in combat situations where hesitation meant death. "Hello, little brother." The two words hit Garrett like a physical blow. 3 years. 3 years of letters that said nothing. 3 years of watching their mother cry into her coffee every morning, their father aging a decade while pretending everything was fine. 3 years of lying awake wondering if his sister was alive, dead, or something worse. And here she was. Not dead, not missing, not broken, transformed into something he'd never imagined. "You—" He couldn't finish the sentence, didn't know how. His throat had closed around words that wouldn't come. Kira took a step toward him, and the crowd parted like water before a ship's prow. No one wanted to be between a Dragon Crest operator and their target, even if that target was family. "I'm sorry," she said, and despite the authority in her voice, the apology carried genuine weight. "It was classified. Is classified. I couldn't tell anyone where I was or what I was doing. Not Mom, not Dad, not you." She moved closer, close enough that only Garrett could hear her next words. "But I thought about you every day. Every single day for 3 years, about teaching you to drive, about your graduation, about all the moments I was missing. And I knew that if I ever got assigned somewhere you ended up, I'd find a way to let you know I was okay." Garrett closed the remaining distance and wrapped his arms around his sister in a hug that felt like it might break both of them. She hugged him back just as fiercely, and for a moment they were just siblings again. Just Kira and Garrett Thorne from Helena, Montana, where the most dangerous thing was winter and the most exciting thing was Friday night football. But only for a moment, because a voice cut through the reunion like a drill sergeant's bark, rough with age and authority, that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the spine. Attention. The command was instinctive, absolute. Every soldier in the mess hall snapped to attention. Back straight, hands at sides, eyes forward. Even Kira released her brother and came to attention with movements so ingrained they were autonomic. The old man from the corner booth walked forward with steps measured by decades of parade grounds and classified operations. 69 years old, wearing civilian clothes that had seen better decades, he nevertheless carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd commanded men in situations where gods feared to tread. He stopped 3 paces from Kira and rendered a salute so crisp it could have cut diamonds. "Lieutenant Kira Thorne, call sign Phantom Raven, Navy SEAL Team 6. His voice carried to every corner of the mess hall, formal and precise. Official recognition of something that had been classified beyond top secret until this very moment. Kira returned the salute with equal precision. "Sir?" "At ease, Lieutenant." The old general lowered his hand. "I believe it's time for proper introductions." He turned to face the crowd of stunned soldiers, and for the first time they saw what 3 weeks of newspapers and terrible coffee had hidden. This wasn't just some retiree killing time on a military base. This was a predator who'd learned to walk among prey so well they'd forgotten what he was. "For those who don't know me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of every mission he'd never been able to discuss. "I am Brigadier General Nathaniel Garrett, United States Army, retired, Delta Force 1980 through 2008. I was recalled from retirement 3 weeks ago to provide oversight for a classified assessment operation at this installation." He pulled up his left sleeve with deliberate slowness, revealing the faded tattoo that covered his forearm. Age had muted the blacks to gray, softened the lines, but the symbol was unmistakable. The same dragon, the same coordinates woven into the design, the same mark that now adorned Kira's back. "Dragon Crest Number 1, General Garrett continued, each word carved from granite and experience. Awarded October 27, 1983, following Operation Urgent Fury in Grenada. I was the first recipient of this mark. Lieutenant Thorne is number 47. He paused, letting that information settle like sediment in still water. 47 recipients across 42 years. The mathematics alone told a story about exclusivity and cost. In the 42 years since the Dragon Crest program began, General Garrett said, his voice taking on a weight that made seasoned soldiers straighten unconsciously. Only 47 individuals have earned this mark. It is not given for time served. It is not awarded for political connections. It cannot be purchased with money or influence. His eyes swept the crowd, and several people found themselves unable to meet that gaze. Those eyes had seen too much, knew too much, judged too accurately. It is earned through actions that cannot be disclosed, in situations that cannot be discussed, facing threats that most Americans will never know existed. He paused, the silence heavy with implication. 34 Dragon Crest recipients have been killed in action. 11 have retired. Lieutenant Thorne and I are 2 of the 13 still active or recalled to active duty. Colonel Marcus Drummond, who'd been standing frozen since the revelation began, finally found his voice. General Garrett I wasn't informed you were on my base, sir. You weren't supposed to be, Colonel. The old general's tone wasn't unkind, but it carried the finality of someone stating facts rather than offering explanations. Need-to-know basis. And until approximately 2 minutes ago, you didn't need to know. Drummond's mind was racing, trying to calculate how he could have missed this. A general officer on his installation for 3 weeks, and he'd never noticed. But then, that was the entire point, wasn't it? That was what made Dragon Crest operators different from conventional special forces. They could hide in plain sight. They could become invisible while standing in full view. They were ghosts who walked in daylight and shadows who survived in sunshine. Kira stepped forward, her voice cutting through the shocked silence with calm authority. My orders were to conduct a comprehensive security assessment of Fort Wainwright under deep cover, to evaluate not just your defensive capabilities or your response protocols, but your personnel, your culture, your leadership. She turned to look directly at Brock Halverson, who remained at attention but looked like a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Sergeant Halverson's behavior this evening has provided extensive data on all 3 fronts. The words landed like artillery shells, each one carrying implications that would reshape careers and futures. Brock's voice emerged as barely more than a croak. Ma'am, I didn't know. If I'd known who you were— Stop! Kira's command cut through his apology like a blade through silk. That's exactly the problem, Sergeant. You're saying if you'd known I was someone important, someone dangerous, someone who could end your career, you would have treated me differently. She took a step toward him, and despite himself, despite his training and his size and his experience, Brock Halverson flinched. The question you should be asking yourself, Kira continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the room, is why didn't you treat me with basic human dignity, regardless of who I was? Why did my apparent powerlessness give you permission to humiliate me? Brock had no answer. The silence stretched like pulled wire threatening to snap under its own tension. Should respect be conditional on rank or reputation? Kira asked, addressing the entire room now. Should basic human dignity depend on someone's ability to fight back? Should we only protect people when we know they're dangerous? The questions hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, unanswerable because everyone present knew the truth. Their behavior had revealed exactly who they were when they thought there would be no consequences. First Lieutenant Sloan Murdoch, who'd been standing frozen with her hand still extended, as if to conduct the search she'd offered, finally lowered her arm. Her voice emerged small and uncertain, stripped of the aggressive confidence she'd worn like armor for 5 years. Ma'am, I thought you were just— Weak, Kira finished for her. Not cruelly, but with the kind of directness that cut deeper than any insult. You thought I was weak. You thought I was an easy target. You thought you could build yourself up by tearing someone else down. She turned to face the entire assembly, her eyes moving from soldier to soldier, making each of them feel the weight of what they'd participated in or witnessed without intervention. This wasn't just about identifying bad leadership or toxic behavior, Kira said. It was about understanding how this installation became vulnerable to infiltration in the first place, because that's what happened here. Fort Wainwright has been compromised. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Soldiers who'd been focused on their own shame suddenly shifted to tactical alertness. Compromised in military terminology meant enemy action, meant active threat. Colonel Drummond stepped forward, his command authority reasserting itself. Compromised how, Lieutenant? Kira pulled a modified laptop from her backpack. Military-grade hardened case encryption protocols visible on the case exterior satellite antenna built into the design. She opened it on a nearby table, and the screen showed a detailed map of Fort Wainwright with multiple locations marked in red. Shadow Protocol, she said, and the name fell into the room like a funeral shroud. In his corner, General Garrett's jaw tightened. He knew that name. Knew it the way you know the name of a disease that killed someone you loved. Knew it with the kind of visceral hatred reserved for betrayals that cut deeper than enemy action. Shadow Protocol was originally formed in 1992. Kira continued, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone delivering an intelligence briefing as a special counterintelligence unit following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its mission was to identify and neutralize internal threats Americans who might sell secrets to the highest bidder in the case following the Cold War. She touched a key and photographs appeared on the screen. Men and women in military uniforms, some young, some old, all marked with red X's that indicated deceased or captured. Over the past 33 years, Shadow Protocol evolved from counterintelligence into something far more dangerous. A rogue organization that sells classified information to anyone willing to pay. They've been responsible for at least 18 compromise operations that we know of, resulting in the deaths of 47 American operatives and uncounted foreign assets. Private Garrett Thorne, still standing near his sister, felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. They're here, on this base. They were, Kira confirmed. For the past 6 months, Shadow Protocol has been running a comprehensive surveillance operation on Fort Wainwright, monitoring communications, documenting security procedures, identifying exploitable personnel for potential recruitment. She brought up a new image on the screen, a man in his early 50s, weathered face marked by sun and violence's eyes that calculated trajectories and vulnerabilities with equal precision. He wore civilian clothes in the photograph, but everything about his bearing screamed career military. Captain Silas Trent, Kira said, her voice hardening almost imperceptibly. Former Delta Force, served with General Garrett in the 1990s, currently operating as Shadow Protocol's senior field operative at this installation. He's been here for 6 months, living in Fairbanks under the identity of a defense contractor consultant. The old general closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they carried the weight of old betrayals and older wars. Trent, he said quietly, the single word containing volumes. I should have known. I should have seen it coming. You couldn't have, sir, Kira said gently. He's very good at what he does. That's why Shadow Protocol recruited him. Recruited him? General Garrett's voice turned sharp. Silas Trent was one of the best operators I ever served with. He saved my life in Somalia. What the hell happened? Bosnia 1995, Kira replied, pulling up another file. Operation Deliberate Force. You were leading a team to extract intelligence assets from Sarajevo. The mission went sideways when Serbian forces moved faster than expected. You had to make a choice. She showed a classified after-action report, and General Garrett's face went pale as he read details he'd spent 30 years trying to forget. 8 intelligence assets who would have exposed NATO operations if captured, Kira continued relentlessly, or 1 Delta Force operator who'd been compromised but might survive Serbian custody. You chose the 8. I chose the mission, General Garrett corrected, his voice rough. I chose to save 8 people who'd die for certain over 1 person who might survive. That's what command means. That's what the job requires. Trent didn't see it that way, Kira said. He was held by Serbian forces for 6 months. Tortured. Broken. When he finally escaped, he was a different person. He believed you'd abandoned him for political convenience. That belief made him vulnerable to recruitment. She closed the file and her voice softened slightly. Shadow Protocol found him in 1996, offered him purpose, money, a way to strike back at the system he believed had betrayed him. He's been working for them ever since. Where is he now? Drummond demanded, his hand moving unconsciously towards his sidearm. Kira checked her laptop, reading data streams that updated in real time. Activating extraction protocols. He's been monitoring this mess hall with remote audio surveillance since Lieutenant Murdoch suggested the body search. He knows we're on to him. She looked up, and her expression carried the kind of calm that comes before violence. We have approximately 8 minutes before he destroys all evidence of Shadow Protocol's presence here and disappears into channels we can't follow. Then we move now, Drummond said, already reaching for his radio. I'll deploy QRF, secure all exits, lock down the base. No, sir. Kira's voice carried absolute authority despite the difference in rank. If you deploy conventional forces, Trent will activate his network's scorched earth protocols. Shadow Protocol has operatives we haven't identified yet. They'll scatter, destroy evidence, and will lose any chance of rolling up the entire organization. Drummond bristled at being told what to do on his own base, but General Garrett stepped in before the situation could escalate. Colonel, stand down. Lieutenant Thorne is correct. This is a Dragon Crest operation. We're just watching her work. The words carried weight that transcended rank. Drummond recognized the implicit command structure Dragon Crest operators answered to chains of command that existed above and beyond normal military hierarchy. This was Kira's operation, had been from the moment she'd walked into that mess hall. The lights in the mess hall flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the space into darkness, broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of red and shadow. Trent's opening move. Cut power to create chaos and confusion. But Kira's voice cut through the sudden panic with calm that seemed almost supernatural. Nobody move, nobody speak, nobody activate any electronic devices. Her command was delivered with such absolute confidence that even Brock, lost in his psychological breakdown, froze in place. The authority in her voice bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the hindbrain where survival instincts lived. In the darkness, Kira moved, not rushing, not panicking, moving with the kind of fluid precision that comes from operating in worse conditions than a darkened mess hall. Her footsteps were silent despite combat boots on linoleum. Her breathing remained controlled despite adrenaline that had to be flooding her system. When she spoke again, her voice came from a completely different location than where she'd been standing seconds before. Private Thorne, you're going to be my communication relay. On my signal, you'll contact base security using landline communications only. Cell phones and radios are compromised. Landline only. Garrett's throat was dry, but his voice remained steady. Yes, ma'am. Authentication code is Tango 77 Echo. Tell them Phantom Raven is active and requesting immediate tactical support for hostile extraction. Repeat that back to me. Tango 77 Echo. Phantom Raven active. Requesting tactical support for hostile extraction. Landline only. Good. There's a landline phone in the kitchen office 30 feet to your left. Move when I give the word. Kira's laptop glowed softly in the darkness, the only source of blue light in a sea of red emergency lighting. The screen showed thermal imaging, heat signatures moving around the base perimeter with tactical precision that spoke of professional military training. General Garrett moved quietly to stand beside her, his own decades of combat experience, and allowing him to read the tactical display with practiced efficiency. How many? He whispered. 12 confirmed, Kira replied just as quietly. Moving in coordinated teams of 3. They're heading for the communication center and the command post. Classic isolation protocol, cut off our ability to call for help before they move on this building. On time, 6 minutes before they reach the comm center. 4 minutes before they're in position to assault this building. Sloane Murdoch, standing close enough to overhear, despite the whispered conversation, felt her training assert itself, despite the chaos of the evening's revelations. Ma'am, if they're moving on communications in command, they're planning to isolate the base before conducting elimination operations. This is a scorched earth scenario. Correct, Lieutenant, Kira said, and there was a note of approval in her voice. Shadow Protocol can't afford witnesses. Everyone in this room has seen too much, knows too much. Their only option is complete elimination followed by evidence destruction. The word should have caused panic, should have sent 200 soldiers scrambling for exits and weapons. But Kira's calm was contagious, spreading through the darkness like an antidote to fear. But they're not expecting us to be ready, she continued. They're expecting chaos and confusion. They're expecting conventional response from conventional soldiers. She began moving through the darkened mess hall, her hands finding objects in the darkness, with the kind of certainty that suggested she'd been mapping the space mentally since the moment she'd entered. What they're getting is something different. Private Thorne, execute communications now. Move. Garrett moved through the darkness toward the kitchen office, his hands outstretched, but his steps confident. 3 months of basic training had included night navigation exercises. This was just another evolution. Kira continued her preparations, and soldiers nearby could hear objects being moved, positioned, arranged with tactical precision. Sergeant Halverson, she called quietly into the darkness. Brock's voice emerged uncertain, stripped of all the aggressive confidence that had defined him hours earlier. Ma'am, you know this base better than anyone here. You know the blind spots, the approach routes, the places where security cameras don't reach. I need that knowledge. It was a small thing, a tiny gesture of redemption offered in the middle of a crisis, but to Brock it felt like being thrown a lifeline while drowning in an ocean of his own failures. Yes, ma'am. What do you need? Shadow Protocol will avoid the main entrances, too visible, too easy to defend. Where would you approach this building if you wanted maximum surprise? Brock's tactical mind, honed by 2 tours in Afghanistan, kicked in automatically. Northeast loading dock. It's used for deliveries, so the exterior door lock is often broken. Security camera died 3 weeks ago and hasn't been replaced. From there, you can access the main mess hall through the kitchen without being seen from the main entrances. How long to move from exterior perimeter to that door? 2 minutes at tactical pace, maybe 90 seconds if they're pushing hard. Kira processed this information with the speed of someone trained to make life or death decisions in milliseconds. Then that's where they'll come, and that's where we'll be waiting. She pulled what looked like a simple chef's knife from a nearby cutting board, testing the weight and balance, with movements that suggested extensive training in blade work. Not ideal, but in skilled hands, any weapon was better than none. Lieutenant Murdoch, you're going to establish a fallback position at the southwest exit. Take 10 soldiers, anyone with medical training. If this goes bad, your job is to get the wounded out. Ma'am, I should be following orders, Lieutenant. I need someone I can trust to protect the people who can't protect themselves. Can you do that? Sloane felt something crack open in her chest. Trust. After what she'd done, after how she'd participated in trying to destroy this woman, Kira was offering her trust. Yes, ma'am, I won't let you down. I know you won't. Kira turned her attention back to the thermal display. The 12 heat signatures had split into 3 groups. 4 heading for the communication center, 4 moving toward the command post, and 4. They're coming, she said quietly. Northeast loading dock, just like Sergeant Halverson predicted. 2 minutes out. In the kitchen office, Private Garrett Thorne was finishing his call to base security, providing authentication codes that would trigger responses from units most soldiers didn't even know existed. He emerged from the office to find his sister standing in the kitchen doorway, silhouetted against emergency lighting, looking like something out of mythology. A warrior goddess preparing for a battle armed with nothing but a kitchen knife and absolute confidence. Backup is 12 minutes out, Garrett reported. Then we hold for 12 minutes, Kira said simply. General Garrett, I need you to take command of the soldiers in the main hall. Keep them calm, keep them quiet. Make sure nobody does anything heroic and stupid. The old general nodded, understanding his role. Sometimes the hardest job in combat wasn't fighting, it was keeping people alive who wanted to help but didn't have the training. The rest of you, Kira continued, addressing the small group that had gathered around her. Understand this, I don't need you to be soldiers right now. I need you to be smart. Stay in the dark, stay quiet, stay alive. The only person engaging the enemy will be me. Ma'am, Corporal Hayes said, his weapons specialist training, rebelling against the idea of letting someone fight alone. We can help. We're trained. We're armed. With sidearms designed for range qualification, not close quarters combat in the dark against operators with night vision and automatic weapons. Kira interrupted. You engage them, you die. It's that simple. Her voice wasn't cruel, just factual, stating realities that needed to be understood. I've been training for scenarios exactly like this since I was 22 years old. I've operated in worse conditions against better equipped enemies. Trust me to do my job, and I'll trust you to do yours, which is staying alive and bearing witness to what happens here. She moved toward the kitchen entrance to the loading dock, her movements economical and precise. Because if I fall, she said quietly, someone needs to survive to tell people what Shadow Protocol is and what they're willing to do. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't get buried in classified archives and forgotten. Then she was gone, melting into the darkness like she'd never been there at all. The next 8 minutes felt like 8 hours. 200 soldiers crouched in the darkness of the main mess hall, listening to sounds they couldn't identify and imagining scenarios their training hadn't prepared them for. In the kitchen, Private Thorne, Sergeant Halverson, and Lieutenant Murdoch waited with the kind of tension that precedes violence, not knowing if they'd hear gunfire or silence, not knowing if Kira would survive, or if they'd be organizing a memorial service for a woman they'd been mocking an hour ago. General Garrett stood in the center of the main hall, his presence alone enough to keep panic from spreading. 69 years old, unarmed, except for a folding knife he'd carried since Grenada, and still the most dangerous person in the room after Kira. The sound when it came wasn't what anyone expected. Not gunfire, not explosions, just a single sharp impact. Metal on bone, then silence, followed by another impact, and another. 4 sounds total, 4 impacts, then nothing. The emergency lighting flickered once, and when it stabilized, Kira was standing in the kitchen doorway. Not a scratch visible on her. The chef's knife in her hand was clean, she'd wiped it before returning. Behind her, visible through the loading dock entrance, 4 figures lay motionless in positions that suggested they'd never known what hit them. Targets neutralized, she said calmly, as if reporting routine training results rather than announcing she'd just taken down 4 enemy operators in hand-to-hand combat in complete darkness. The other 8 will know something went wrong when this team doesn't report in. We have maybe 3 minutes before they adapt their tactics. She pulled out her laptop, checking status updates with the kind of multitasking that suggested she was processing information at a level most people couldn't maintain under stress. Backup is 7 minutes out. Shadow Protocol's other teams are converging on this position. We're about to get hit from 2 directions simultaneously. How do we? Drummond started to ask, but Kira's laptop chimed with an incoming priority alert that made her smile for the first time all evening. A genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face from warrior to something almost human. Never mind, she said. Backup just arrived early. The main doors of the mess hall burst open with a sound like thunder. But what entered wasn't Shadow Protocol operatives. Figures in full tactical gear moved with the fluid precision of elite operators, their movements coordinated to the point of seeming choreographed. Night vision goggles, body armor that looked like it could stop tank rounds, weapons held with casual competence that spoke of more firefights than most soldiers would see in their entire careers. The team leader's voice emerged amplified through a tactical headset. Phantom Raven status report. Area secure, casualties nil, witnesses protected. Kira replied, her response delivered in the crisp military terminology that belonged to classified operations. Hostile teams converging from north and west. 8 confirmed. Copy that. Dragon 6 has them on thermal. They're not going anywhere. The team leader removed her helmet, revealing features weathered by sun and combat. Maybe 45 years old, with a scar running from her left eyebrow to her jawline that told stories she'd never speak aloud in public. She pulled down the collar of her tactical vest, revealing a flash of ink on her collarbone. Another dragon, another crest, another member of a club that numbered 13 living souls. Colonel Bryn Ashford, the woman announced, her voice carrying command authority that matched General Garrett's. Dragon Crest number 18, Gulf War, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan. Lieutenant Thorne, good to see you're still in one piece. You too, ma'am, Kira replied with genuine warmth. Montana Cell. Just finished dismantling Shadow Protocol's Western Operations Hub in Billings. Figured I'd swing by and help with cleanup. Brought 11 friends. She gestured to the tactical team, spreading through the mess hall with practiced efficiency. Other members of the team were removing gear, revealing more Dragon Crest tattoos. Not all in the same place, some on arms, some on shoulders, one on the back of a man's neck, but all the same symbol. The same mark of something that transcended normal military service. Private Garrett Thorne watched this reunion of elite operators and felt like he'd stumbled into a movie. These people moved like they operated according to different physics than everyone else. Faster, more precise, more dangerous. Colonel Ashford's radio crackled. Dragon 6, this is Perimeter 3. We have 8 hostiles in custody. No shots fired. They walked right into our positions like they didn't even know we were there. Copy that, Perimeter 3. Secure them for transport. I want them alive and talkative. She turned to Kira with a slight smile. Your operation, Lieutenant. How do you want to proceed? And just like that, the power dynamic in the room shifted again. Not to the most senior officer, not to the person with the most experience. To the operator whose mission this was, whose assessment had triggered everything that followed. Bring Captain Trent to me, Kira said quietly. I want to look him in the eyes when he realizes he's been played. 10 minutes later, Silas Trent knelt on the mess hall floor with zip ties securing his wrists and blood streaming from a broken nose. 52 years old, former Delta Force, current Shadow Protocol senior operative, and currently experiencing the worst night of his professional life. He looked up at General Garrett with something approaching disbelief. Bull, he said, using the nickname from 30 years ago. You're 69 years old. How are you still doing this? The old general looked down at his former friend, his former brother-in-arms, his current prisoner, and felt something break inside his chest that had been held together by willpower and duty for too many years. I'm not doing this, Silas. She is. He gestured to Kira, who stood nearby with her laptop already processing the intelligence they'd captured. Trent's eyes moved to the small woman he'd been monitoring for weeks, the target he'd thought was just another deep cover operator running a routine assessment. And he saw finally what everyone else in the room had already learned. She wasn't routine, wasn't standard, wasn't anything close to what he'd expected. You played me, he said, genuine admiration cutting through his defeat. From the moment you walked into this mess hall, this whole thing was theater designed to draw us out. Not theater, Kira corrected. Assessment. The humiliation was real. The evaluation of base culture was real. The fact that it also served as bait for Shadow Protocol was just efficient multitasking. She knelt down to his eye level, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Shadow Protocol is finished, Captain Trent. Colonel Ashford dismantled your Western operations. My team handled the North. And right now, in 17 other locations across 6 countries, Dragon Crest operators are shutting down every cell you've built over the past 30 years. She pulled up her laptop and showed him images that made his face go pale. Shadow Protocol operatives in custody, safe houses being raided, financial networks being frozen, communication systems being shut down. The organization he'd served for decades was being systematically destroyed. We've been hunting you for 3 years, Kira continued, and you never knew we were there. Because that's what we do. We're ghosts who walk in daylight, shadows that hide in plain sight, and we protect this country from threats that most Americans will never know existed. She stood up, signaling to the tactical team to take the prisoners away, including threats that come from within. As Shadow Protocol operatives were marched out of the mess hall towards secure detention, Colonel Drummond finally found his voice. Lieutenant Thorne, I need to apologize for not seeing this earlier, for allowing my base to be compromised, for... You couldn't have known, sir, Kira interrupted, her voice not unkind. That was the entire point. Shadow Protocol specializes in exploiting blind spots in our own security culture. Places where protocol says to look, but human nature says to ignore. She gestured at the mess hall at the soldiers who'd been part of her humiliation. Places like this, where toxic leadership creates division, where harassment becomes normalized, where people who should protect each other instead tear each other down. Those cultural failures create security vulnerabilities that enemies exploit. General Garrett stepped forward, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen this pattern repeat across decades. Which is why Phase 3 begins now. Phase 3, Drummond asked. Transformation, Kira replied. Assessment phase complete. Neutralization phase finished. Now we implement the systemic changes necessary to prevent this from happening again. She pulled up new files on her laptop, organizational charts, training protocols, cultural initiatives that had been developed over years of study and hard-won experience. Colonel Drummond, effective immediately, you're tasked with implementing Dragon Legacy protocols throughout Fort Wainwright. You'll receive comprehensive briefing materials within 24 hours. Drummond straightened to attention, recognizing both the honor and the responsibility. Yes, ma'am. What should I prioritize? A cultural transformation, Kira said without hesitation. Security vulnerabilities can be patched with technology and new procedures. But the human factor is always the most critical and the most difficult to address. She looked at Brockett Sloan, at all the others who'd participated in her humiliation or witnessed it without intervention. Starting with these soldiers, starting tonight, the emergency lights flickered, then steadied. Regular power began flowing back through the building, fluorescent fixtures humming to life and washing away the red shadows of emergency lighting. In the harsh white light, 200 soldiers stood witness to something they'd never seen before and would never forget. The moment when a small woman they'd mocked proved to be the most dangerous person any of them would ever meet. The moment when 13 Dragon Crest operators scattered across the globe, but connected by something deeper than geography, struck simultaneously to destroy an organization that had threatened their country for 3 decades. And the moment when everything they thought they knew about strength, power, and service was turned inside out and revealed as hollow pretense. Private Garrett Thorne looked at his sister, really looked at her, and saw someone he'd never known. Someone who'd been hiding in plain sight their entire lives, waiting for the moment when her true purpose could be revealed. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years you've been fighting this war. Kira turned to her brother, and for just a moment the legendary operator fell away, and he saw the sister who'd taught him to ride a bike and helped him with algebra homework. Longer than that, Garrett. I've been fighting since the day I put on this uniform. We all have. The Dragon Crest operators. The ones who came before. The ones who'll come after. She looked around the mess hall at young soldiers whose worlds had just been shattered and rebuilt in the span of hours. And now we teach the next generation to fight smarter, to fight better, to fight without becoming the thing we're fighting against. General Garrett moved to stand beside her, and the 2 Dragon Crest operators, number 1 and number 47, separated by 42 years and connected by something deeper than time, stood together as the weight of what had happened tonight began to sink in for everyone present. Outside, the Alaskan night was falling, fast temperature, dropping toward the kind of cold that could kill in minutes. But inside Fort Wainwright's mess hall, something new was being born from the ashes of what had been destroyed. A legacy that would span generations. A promise that would outlive them all. and a truth that had been written in ink and blood and sacrifice across 42 years of secret wars, that the strongest warriors were often the ones nobody saw coming until it was far too late, and that sometimes the people you underestimate are the ones who change everything. 3 months later, Fort Wainwright in February was a landscape of absolutes. Temperature 52 below zero, daylight barely 5 hours, wind that stripped exposed flesh to bone in minutes. The kind of environment that didn't forgive weakness or hesitation, where survival required respect for natural forces beyond human control. Sergeant Brock Halverson, demoted to private first class 3 days after the incident, promoted back to sergeant 2 months later, following intensive psychological evaluation and demonstrated transformation, stood before 30 soldiers in the newly established Ethical Leadership Center and felt sweat running down his spine despite the Arctic cold outside. The room was small and deliberately austere. No flags, no motivational posters, no military pageantry. Just chairs arranged in a circle and windows that looked out on a landscape white and merciless. 3 months ago, Brock had commanded attention through intimidation, had filled rooms with his physical presence and aggressive confidence, had built his entire identity around being the biggest, hardest, most dangerous person in any space he occupied. Now he stood in front of peers and subordinates, trying to explain how spectacularly wrong he'd been about everything. 3 months ago, he began, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. I stood in the mess hall about 200 meters from here and demonstrated everything a military leader shouldn't be. The soldiers watching him remained silent. Many of them had been there that night. All of them knew the story by now. It had spread through Fort Wainwright like wildfire, then through other installations, then through the entire military community, until it became legend. The night a Navy SEAL got humiliated and changed everything. I used my rank to intimidate. Brock continued, forcing himself to maintain eye contact despite the shame burning in his chest. I confused dominance with leadership. I created an environment where cruelty was rewarded and moral courage was punished. He paused, gathering strength for what came next, the part that still felt like swallowing broken glass. And I did it because I was afraid. Corporal Daniel Hayes, sitting in the front row, leaned forward slightly. He'd been there. He'd participated. He'd spent the last 3 months in the same rehabilitation program as Brock, working through his own demons and failures. My father was killed in the Battle of Mogadishu in 1993. Brock said, his voice roughening with emotion he'd spent 34 years learning to suppress. Black Hawk Down, they called it later. Staff Sergeant Michael Halverson. Killed in action, October 3rd, 1993, when I was 2 years old. He pulled a worn photograph from his pocket and held it up. A young man in Army uniform, maybe 25 years old, grinning at the camera with the kind of confidence that comes from not knowing you're about to die. I don't remember him, not his voice, not his face, nothing except this picture and the stories my mother told me when I was old enough to understand. Brock's hands tightened on the photograph. She told me he was brave, strong, fearless, a warrior who died protecting his brothers. The silence in the room had weight now, substance. These weren't just soldiers listening to a lecture. These were people witnessing something raw and real. I spent my entire life trying to live up to a man I never knew, Brock continued. Trying to be strong enough, tough enough, hard enough that nothing could hurt me the way losing him hurt my mother. And somewhere along the way, I confused being strong with being cruel. I thought if I could make others feel small, it would make me feel big enough to fill the hole my father left. He looked around the room, making eye contact with each soldier. Lieutenant Thorne showed me something that night. She showed me that my father, the man I was trying to honor, would have been disgusted by what I'd become. Because real strength isn't about making others feel small. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about standing up when standing up is hard. It's about being the kind of person who makes others better, not broken. His voice cracked on the last words, and he didn't try to hide it. 3 months ago, showing emotion would have felt like weakness. Now he understood it was the only honest thing he had to offer. I'm not standing here because I figured it out, Brock finished quietly. I'm standing here because I'm trying. Every single day. Some days I fail. Some days the old patterns come back and I find myself wanting to intimidate instead of lead. But Lieutenant Thorne gave me something I didn't deserve, a second chance. And I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure I earn it. As he stepped away from the center of the circle, the soldiers in the room began to applaud. Not the perfunctory clapping of military courtesy, but genuine respect for someone who'd shown them his scars and his struggles. Private First Class Garrett Thorne, sitting in the back row, found himself blinking away tears. 3 months ago, he'd watched this man try to destroy his sister. Now he was watching that same man try to rebuild himself into something better. Redemption, Garrett was learning, looked nothing like he'd expected. It wasn't dramatic or clean. It was messy and painful and required more courage than any firefight. After the session concluded, Brock found Garrett waiting outside in the brutal cold. "Private Thorne," Brock said, his voice uncertain. They'd barely spoken since the incident, beyond required military courtesy. "Sir," Garrett replied, then corrected himself. "Sergeant Halverson." "I wanted to—" Brock paused, searching for words. "I wanted to apologize. To you specifically. For what I tried to do to your sister." Garrett studied the older man's face, seeing genuine remorse rather than performative regret. "She's already forgiven you, otherwise you wouldn't still be here." "But you haven't," Brock said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Garrett admitted. "Not yet, but I'm working on it." Brock nodded, accepting that. "Fair enough. I'll keep trying to deserve it." He started to walk away, then stopped and turned back. "Your sister is the most dangerous person I've ever met, and I've served with Special Forces operators in Afghanistan. But you know what makes her truly dangerous." "What?" "She's dangerous because she makes you want to be better. Not through fear or intimidation, through being an example of what leadership actually looks like." Brock's expression was serious. "Don't waste the opportunity to learn from her, because people like her don't come along often." As Brock walked away into the Arctic darkness, Garrett stood alone in the cold and thought about his sister. About the person she'd become in 3 years of classified operations. About the burden she carried that he was only beginning to understand. Across the base in the newly renovated Dragon Legacy training facility, Lieutenant Colonel Kira Thorne, promoted 2 months earlier, the youngest person to hold that rank in modern Army history, reviewed tactical assessments on 3 wall-mounted screens, while Colonel Bryn Ashford studied satellite imagery from 17 installations currently implementing the new protocols. The promotion had come with the kind of speed that only happened when the President of the United States personally intervened. Lieutenant to lieutenant colonel in a single jump, bypassing captain and major entirely. Unprecedented, controversial, and absolutely necessary for what came next. The facility occupied what had been an underutilized warehouse, transformed in 8 weeks into something that looked nothing like traditional military training infrastructure. No parade grounds, no obstacle courses, no drill sergeants breaking people down to build them back up. Instead, simulation rooms where soldiers practiced de-escalation. Lecture halls where psychologists taught the neuroscience of trauma and leadership. Small group spaces where people learned to communicate across differences of rank and experience and background. 17 installations, Kira said, studying data streams that updated in real time. 4,800 soldiers enrolled in the first wave. Preliminary results showing 67% improvement in unit cohesion and 89% reduction in harassment complaints. Ashford whistled low. "Those numbers are better than we projected." "They're better than we had any right to expect," Kira agreed, "but they're also just surface indicators. Cultural transformation isn't measured in 3-month increments. It's generational work." She pulled up projections showing timelines that extended decades into the future. 5 years to establish baseline protocols. 10 years to see measurable change in retention and effectiveness. 20 years before the transformation became self-sustaining culture rather than imposed program. "The question," Ashford said, leaning back in her chair with the kind of weariness that comes from watching reform efforts fail, "is whether we can maintain momentum. Change is easy when it's new and supported by presidential attention. The hard part comes in year 3, year 5, when the spotlight moves on and institutional resistance starts eroding what we've built." Kira nodded, recognizing the truth in that assessment, and Ashford had 45 years of experience watching well-intentioned reforms get diluted and discarded. She'd seen promises made and broken. She'd watched good ideas die through neglect and bureaucratic inertia. "That's why we need the next generation ready to take over," Kira said quietly. "People like my brother, like Brock Halverson, believe it or not, like the 200 soldiers who witnessed what happened and understood what it meant." "Speaking of your brother," Ashford said with a slight smile, "the selection board finished deliberations yesterday. He's been approved for Dragon Crest candidacy." Kira felt pride and apprehension war in her chest. She'd known it was coming, had recognized the moment Garrett stood up in that mess hall that he had the character the program looked for. But knowing didn't make it easier. "When's the ceremony?" she asked quietly. "Next week. General Garrett will perform the marking himself." Ashford pulled up Garrett's file on one of the screens. 21 years old, exceptional tactical training scores. perfect psychological evaluation, and demonstrated moral courage under conditions that would have broken most people. She looked at Kira with knowing eyes. You recused yourself from the selection board. Good call. Keeps it clean. But you should know it was unanimous. He earned this on his own merit. Before Kira could respond, the facility door opened and General Nathaniel Garrett entered, accompanied by Colonel Drummond and a woman Kira didn't recognize. Early 50s conservative business suit, the kind of bearing that suggested she was accustomed to walking into rooms and immediately becoming the most important person there. Lieutenant Colonel Thorne, Colonel Ashford, Drummond said formally. I'd like to introduce Assistant Secretary of Defense Rachel Winters. She's here to observe our Dragon Legacy implementation and assess potential for expansion across all service branches. Kira and Ashford came to attention automatically, but Winters waved them at ease with practiced efficiency. Please, let's skip the formalities. I'm not here for briefings designed to impress oversight committees. Her voice carried the kind of directness that came from dealing with military bureaucracy for decades. I'm here because the president is very interested in what's happening at Fort Wainwright, and she wants to know if it can be scaled to the entire armed forces. The president, the actual commander-in-chief. Kira felt her pulse quicken, but kept her voice steady. Ma'am, the Dragon Legacy program was designed with that exact scaling in mind, but I need to be clear about something up front, which is, this isn't a quick fix. This isn't something you implement with a memo and PowerPoint presentations and call it done. Kira met the assistant secretary's eyes directly. Real cultural transformation requires sustained commitment at every level of leadership over years, probably decades. Half measures and budget cuts and political interference will kill it before it can take root. Winters smiled and the expression reached her eyes. Lieutenant Colonel, I've spent 20 years in the Pentagon watching people promise me easy solutions to hard problems. The fact that you're being honest about the challenges makes me more inclined to support this, not less. She moved to the screen showing data from the 17 pilot installations, studying numbers with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to read between the lines and spot manipulation. Walk me through it, Winters said. Not the sanitized version designed for congressional testimony. The real version. What's working? What's failing? Where are the pain points? For the next 2 hours, Kira and Ashford provided the most comprehensive and brutally honest assessment they'd given anyone outside the Dragon Crest community. They talked about successes installations where toxic leaders had been removed and replaced with people committed to the new approach, where harassment rates had dropped and retention had improved. They talked about failures places where institutional resistance was so entrenched that meaningful change seemed impossible, where commanders paid lip service to the program while actively undermining it, where soldiers who bought into the new culture found themselves isolated and punished. They talked about soldiers like Brock Halverson, who genuinely transformed themselves through intensive work and honest self-examination. And they talked about soldiers like Captain Ryan Blake from Shadow Protocol, who'd refused all rehabilitation and would spend the next 20 years in federal prison. What you're describing, Winters said, finally her voice thoughtful, is essentially rebuilding military culture from the foundation up. That's not a 3-year project. That's not even a 10-year project. No, ma'am, Kira agreed. It's generational work. But the alternative is continuing to be vulnerable to exactly the kind of infiltration and exploitation that Shadow Protocol represented. We can change our culture deliberately and thoughtfully, or we can let our enemies do it for us through manipulation and compromise. Winters was quiet for a long moment, thinking through implications and political realities that existed far above Kira's pay grade. I'm going to recommend to the president that we fully fund Dragon Legacy expansion, she said finally. 5-year initial commitment with option for renewal. Budget allocation that actually matches the scope of what you're trying to accomplish. Full implementation across all branches of service. She turned to look directly at Kira and her expression shifted to something more serious. But I'm also going to recommend that you be appointed as National Director of the program, reporting directly to the Secretary of Defense. This needs someone who understands both the tactical and strategic implications. Someone who's proven they can operate at the highest levels while maintaining connection to ground-level reality. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Kira felt her mouth go dry. National Director, Pentagon appointment, a position that would consume her life and define her career and carry weight she could barely comprehend at 27 years old. Ma'am, I'm not sure I'm qualified for... You're qualified because you walked into that mess hall knowing exactly what was going to happen and used it to build something better, Winters interrupted. You're qualified because you've proven you can fight wars in shadows and boardrooms with equal effectiveness. You're qualified because every Dragon Crest operator I've consulted has recommended you. She glanced at General Garrett, who'd remained silent throughout the entire conversation. General Garrett has agreed to serve as senior advisor for 3 years to help you navigate Pentagon politics and military bureaucracy. After that, the program is entirely yours. What do you say? Kira looked at her mentor, searching his weathered face for guidance. Those eyes had seen 50 years of military service from Vietnam-era Cold War operations through the War on Terror. If anyone understood what this position would cost, it was him. He gave her a small nod. The decision is yours. I'll support whatever you choose. On one condition, Kira said finally. Winters raised an eyebrow, which is that we do this right. No shortcuts, no political compromises that gut the program's effectiveness. No budget cuts that force us to choose between doing this properly and doing it fast. Kira's voice hardened with determination. We get one chance to transform military culture. If we fail because we weren't willing to commit the resources and time required, that failure will set back reform efforts for a generation. Agreed, Winters said without hesitation. The president is committed to seeing this through. She understands that some things are worth the investment even when the returns won't show up in a single administration. She extended her hand. Welcome to the Pentagon, Lieutenant Colonel Thorne. Try not to let it destroy your soul. Kira shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of what she'd just accepted settle onto shoulders that seemed too small for the burden. But then again, she'd felt that way standing in the mess hall 3 months ago, and she'd carried that weight successfully. I'll do my best, ma'am. 1 week later, in a secured facility deep within Fort Wainwright that didn't appear on any official base map, 13 Dragon Crest operators gathered for a ceremony that would be recorded in classified archives but never publicly acknowledged. The room was small and deliberately austere. Concrete walls, single overhead light, no windows, no flags, no military pageantry. Just 13 people who'd earned the right to be there through actions that would never be fully disclosed. Private First Class Garrett Thorne stood at the center of the room in physical training uniform, his shirt already removed. 21 years old, lean muscle built through 3 months of the hardest training the Army could devise, trying very hard not to shake. Around him stood the living legends of the Dragon Crest program. Men and women ranging from 27 to 69 years old, each of them carrying scars visible and invisible, each of them bound by promises made in blood and ink. General Nathaniel Garrett, number 1. 69 years old, preparing for retirement after serving longer than most of these operators had been alive. Lieutenant Colonel Kira Thorne, number 47. 27 years old, carrying the future of the program on shoulders that had already proven they could bear impossible weight. Colonel Bryn Ashford, number 18. 45 years old, Gulf War veteran with a scar that ran from eyebrow to jaw and stories that would never be told. Master Sergeant Donovan Cross, number 23. 51 years old. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Somalia. 27 years of continuous deployment to places that didn't exist on maps. Lieutenant Commander Isla Rutherford, number 31. 38 years old, Navy SEAL, the second woman to earn the crest after the program officially opened to female operators. Major Reed Blackwell, number 28. 43 years old, Delta Force, specializing in operations where success was measured in millimeters and milliseconds. Captain Freya Sinclair, number 33. 35 years old, currently fighting the hardest battle of her career, implementing Dragon Legacy at Fort Bragg. Sergeant First Class Thaddeus Kane, number 41. 48 years old, carrying wisdom earned through survival in places where most people died. And 5 others whose names were classified even within the Dragon Crest community, whose operations existed in shadows so deep that light had never touched them. 13 operators, 6 men, 7 women, ages 21 to 69. Different backgrounds, different specialties, different scars, but the same mark, the same promise, the same willingness to pay prices most people couldn't imagine. General Garrett stood at the front of the room beside a table that held professional tattoo equipment, sterilized and ready. His hands, gnarled with arthritis and scarred from 5 decades of classified operations, were nevertheless steady as a surgeon's. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 48 years of service and 34 brothers and sisters who should have been in this room but weren't. The Dragon Crest is not a reward. It is not a trophy. It is not a mark of prestige or status. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment in still water. It is a promise, a commitment that from this moment forward, you place the mission above yourself, the team above your ego, the country above your comfort, the people who cannot protect themselves above your own safety. He gestured to the 12 other operators in the room. 34 people who wore this mark have been killed in action. Every single one of them knew the risks when they accepted it. Every single one of them made the choice anyway, because they understood that some promises are worth keeping no matter what they cost. General Garrett picked up the tattoo gun, checking the ink and needle with practiced efficiency. Private Thorne, you demonstrated moral courage when it would have been easier and safer to remain silent. You stood up for someone you thought was powerless, knowing it would make you a target. That is the essence of what we do. That is what the Dragon Crest represents. He made eye contact with the young man before him, and his voice softened slightly. This is your last chance to walk away. Once you accept this mark, your life changes forever. There is no going back. There is no undoing what will be done. You will carry this burden until the day you die, and that day may come sooner because of the choices you'll make. Do you understand? Garrett's voice came out steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. I understand, sir. Then let's begin. The tattoo process took 4 hours and 17 minutes. General Garrett worked with meticulous precision, each line placed with mathematical accuracy, each detail rendered with the kind of care that came from doing this 46 times before and understanding the sacred nature of the work. The dragon took shape slowly across Garrett's left shoulder blade and down his arm. Not the massive backpiece his sister carried, but a design scaled appropriately for a male operator who needed the ability to conceal it under standard uniform. The dragon coiled in a protective spiral scales, individually detailed claws gripping a banner that bore the same coordinates that appeared on every Dragon Crest 12.0 degrees north, 61.7 degrees west, Point Salines Airfield, Grenada, where it all began. Garrett Thorne didn't make a sound throughout the entire process, didn't flinch, didn't ask for breaks. He'd watched his sister endure worse things in silence. He could handle this. When it was finally complete, General Garrett set down the tattoo gun and stepped back to examine his work. The dragon seemed to move in the overhead lighting, alive and watchful. Dragon Crest number 48. The old general announced, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. Welcome to the family. The other 12 operators came forward one by one, each of them placing a hand on Garrett's shoulder in silent acknowledgement. No speeches, no grand declarations. Just the weight of recognition from people who understood what he'd accepted. Kira was last. She placed her hand over the fresh tattoo, feeling the heat of inflamed skin beneath her palm, and leaned close enough that only her brother could hear. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so sorry for what this will cost. Garrett turned to look at his sister, seeing past the legendary operator to the person who'd taught him to ride a bike and helped him with homework and left home to fight wars he'd never fully understand. You taught me that some prices are worth paying, he said quietly. That standing for something means standing up when it's hard. I'm ready for the pet. Kira hoped he was right, feared he wasn't, knew it didn't matter because the choice was made and the mark was permanent and the promise was binding. The ceremony concluded with a tradition that dated back to General Garrett's first operation. The 13 operators formed a circle, each of them revealing their Dragon Crest marks. Different placements, different ages of ink, different stories behind each one. But the same symbol, the same coordinates, the same promise. They stood in silence for exactly 2 minutes and 16 seconds, 4 seconds for each of the 34 fallen, then broke the circle and returned to being individual operators with separate missions and distinct lives. But they were connected now, all of them, across distance and time and the barriers that normally separated rank and age and experience, connected by ink and blood and sacrifice that would bind them until death. The following evening, all 13 Dragon Crest operators gathered again in the same facility for something unprecedented in the program's history. A reunion, a memorial, a moment to honor those who couldn't be there. General Garrett stood at the front of the room, and for the first time in his career, the weight of 48 years threatened to crush him. 34 empty seats, 34 brothers and sisters who should have been here but weren't. We gather, he said, his voice rough with emotion, to honor those who cannot be here, to remember the 34 who paid the final price, to acknowledge that we stand here because they fell there. The room fell silent. Each operator lost in their own memories of friends who'd become family, who'd made the ultimate sacrifice for missions that would never be acknowledged and victories that would never be celebrated. General Garrett began speaking names, slowly, deliberately, giving each one the weight it deserved. Sarah Blackwood, number 15, killed in action, Syria 2023. Single mother of a 6-year-old boy, died protecting 43 people from a suicide bomber. Marcus Rivers, number 7, killed in action, Afghanistan 2019. 28 years old, died holding a position so his team could evacuate civilians. James Washington, number 3, killed in action, Iraq 2004, first African-American to receive the Dragon Crest. Died dismantling an IED that would have killed an entire platoon. One by one he spoke the names. 34 lives, 34 families who'd never know the full truth of what their loved ones had done. 34 promises kept unto death. When he finished, the silence stretched for exactly 2 minutes and 16 seconds before Kira stepped forward. "They didn't die for nothing," she said quietly. "They died believing that what they were fighting for mattered, that the sacrifice meant something, that somewhere down the line their deaths would make a difference." She looked around at the assembled operators, her voice gaining strength. "We're going to prove they were right. Dragon legacy, the cultural transformation, the next generation we're training. All of it is proof that their sacrifice mattered, that the promises they made and kept were worth the cut." Colonel Ashford nodded. 48 Dragon Crests awarded, 34 killed in action, 13 still standing. Those are hard numbers to face. "They are," General Garrett agreed, "but they're also a reminder. We're not invincible. We're not superhuman. We're just people who chose to stand between darkness and light, knowing it might cost us everything." He looked at young Garrett Thorne, fresh tattoo still healing on his shoulder. "And we keep choosing it. Every day, every mission, every moment when we could walk away but don't, because that's what the mark means. That's what the promise requires." The gathering concluded as it had begun, in silence. No speeches beyond what had been spoken. No grand declarations. Just 13 people who understood what the mark meant and what it cost. As they filed out into the Alaskan night, Kira stood with her brother and watched the others disappear into darkness. "Do you understand now," she asked quietly, "what you've joined, what it really means?" Garrett touched his dragon crest and nodded. "I understand that 34 people died believing this mattered. And I understand that I'd rather die proving they were right than live knowing I didn't try." Kira pulled her brother into a hug that felt like goodbye and promise all at once. "Then let's make sure their sacrifice means something." 3 days later, Assistant Secretary Winters returned to Fort Wainwright with news that would reshape everything. She found Kira in the Dragon Legacy Training Facility reviewing final preparations for the upcoming expansion to 40 installations across all service branches. The President approved full funding, Winters announced without preamble. 5-year commitment with guaranteed renewal pending results assessment, budget allocation of $1.2 billion, expansion to all branches. "This is happening, Lieutenant Colonel." Kira felt her breath catch. Full funding, 5 years, $1.2 billion. This was real. This was actually happening. "There's more." Winters continued, her expression becoming more serious. "The President wants to meet you, wants to understand firsthand what happened here and what it means for the future of military culture. When Next month, she's cleared her schedule for a 3-day visit to Fort Wainwright. She'll observe training, meet with participants, talk to people who've been through the program." Winters paused and something in her expression shifted. "She's also going to announce the Dragon Legacy Initiative publicly. Not the classified aspects. The Dragon Crest program itself remains compartmentalized at the highest levels, but the cultural transformation component, the leadership training, the harassment prevention protocols, all of it goes public." Kira understood the implications immediately. Going public meant scrutiny, meant criticism from people who thought the military was becoming too soft, meant political fights and endless questions about necessity and effectiveness. But it also meant legitimacy, meant resources, meant the possibility of change that outlived any single administration or commanding officer. "We're ready," Kira said, hoping it was true. 2 weeks later, Kira received an encrypted message on her secure laptop that made her blood run cold. The sender was listed only as Dragon Zero, a designation that shouldn't exist. Dragon Crest numbering started at 1 with General Garrett 42 years ago. She opened the message in a secured room, General Garrett standing beside her at her request. The text was brief: "Congratulations on your promotion, Lieutenant Colonel, but you should know there were 48 Dragon Crests awarded. Only 47 are accounted for in official records. I am number 0, the original. The one they erased when they decided women couldn't handle what this program required. I've been operating off books for 42 years, watching, waiting, making sure the program stayed true to its purpose. Your work at Fort Wainwright has impressed me. We need to meet. Anchorage 2 weeks. Come alone. Bring your brother. You're both ready for what comes next. Victoria Cross. General Garrett's face went white. Actually, white color draining like someone had opened a valve. That's impossible, he said quietly. Victoria Cross died in Lebanon in 1982. Beirut barracks bombing. I was there. I saw, I saw what was left. Apparently not by, Kira said, studying the message's authentication codes. They were legitimate. Whoever sent this had access to systems that no longer officially existed, had knowledge of protocols that predated the official Dragon Crest program. If she's alive, General Garrett continued, his voice shaking slightly, if she's been operating for 42 years without anyone knowing, then everything we think we know about Dragon Crest history is wrong. He sat down heavily, suddenly looking every day of his 69 years. Victoria Cross was the original, before Grenada, before the official program. She was Delta Force when Delta Force didn't officially admit women, 1979 through 1982. She did things in the Iranian hostage crisis in the Cold War that would make Shadow Protocol look like amateur hour. He met Kira's eyes and she saw something there she'd never seen before. Fear. And if she's reaching out now after 42 years of silence, it means something catastrophic is coming. Something that requires Dragon Zero to break cover. Kira stared at the message, feeling implications multiply like fractal patterns. Do I go? Yes, General Garrett said without hesitation. But you don't go alone. Your brother goes with you, and I want a backup team within 5 minutes of your position at all times. The message said, come alone. The message can go to hell. You're my responsibility until I retire, and I'm not letting you walk into a potential trap alone. His voice softened slightly. Besides, if Victoria Cross is who she says she is, she'll understand the precaution. She'd do the same thing. 2 weeks later, Kira and her brother stood in a safe house in Anchorage, Alaska, waiting for a ghost to materialize. The location had been provided in a second encrypted message coordinates that led to an abandoned fish processing plant on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place that had probably been used for 100 clandestine meetings over the years. Colonel Ashford and her team were positioned 5 minutes away, close enough to respond, but far enough not to spook their target. General Garrett was monitoring from Fort Wainwright, connected by encrypted satellite link. The door opened at precisely 1900 hours. The woman who entered looked nothing like the photographs and classified files that General Garrett had pulled from archives so old they were still on microfiche. Those showed a fierce warrior in her 30s, all sharp edges and sharper eyes. This woman was 64 years old, silver hair pulled back in a braid, face lined by sun and time and things that aged people faster than years, scars visible on her hands and neck that spoke of violence survived and battles won. But her eyes, those were the same. The eyes of someone who'd seen the worst humanity could offer and decided to fight it anyway. Dragon 47, Dragon 48, Victoria Cross's voice carried the weight of 4 decades operating in shadows. Thank you for coming, and for bringing backup, even though I said come alone. I'd have done the same thing. She moved to a table and laid down a tablet, pulling up files that made the Shadow Protocol operation look like a training exercise. Shadow Protocol wasn't the real threat, Victoria said quietly. It was a symptom, a test run, a way for our enemies to see if the new generation of Dragon Crest operators could handle what's actually coming. And what's coming? Garrett asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm. Victoria's smile was on and knowing and tired. Everything. In 6 months, a coalition of rogue intelligence agencies from 14 countries is going to attempt a coordinated strike on American infrastructure. Power grids, financial systems, communication networks, water treatment facilities. They're going to try to bring us to our knees without firing a single shot. She pulled up schematics and operational plans that looked like they'd been developed by people who understood systems better than the people who'd built them. This makes Shadow Protocol look like shoplifting, Kira said quietly, scrolling through the files. The scope was staggering. The coordination required was almost unimaginable. Exactly, Victoria confirmed, which is why I've been positioning assets for 3 years, building networks, placing operators, getting ready for the moment when I could bring this to someone who'd understand what needed to be done. She looked at Kira with eyes that had seen too much and known too well. You, Lieutenant Colonel, you're going to stop them, because that's what the Dragon Legacy program was really built for. Not just cultural transformation. Preparation. building a military culture that can handle threats that don't wear uniforms and wars that don't have front lines. Kira felt pieces clicking into place. The rushed timeline, the president's personal involvement, General Garrett's insistence that she take over despite her age, Assistant Secretary Winter's immediate approval of full funding. They'd all known this was coming. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. 3 years, Victoria admitted. "Since the day you first applied for SEAL training. We've been preparing you, testing you, building the program around you and operators like you, making sure you'd be ready when the time came." She stood preparing to leave, and Kira realized this meeting was ending. "You passed every test," Victoria continued. "You and your brother both. Now comes the real work. The work that 34 Dragon Crest operators died preparing for without knowing it." Victoria moved toward the door, then paused. The Dragon Crest was never just about creating elite operators. It was about creating protectors who could operate in a world where the old rules don't apply anymore, where threats don't announce themselves and wars don't have clear endings. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Your generation will face challenges mine never imagined, but you'll face them the same way we did, with courage, with sacrifice, and with the knowledge that some promises are worth keeping no matter the cost." She opened the door, Arctic wind rushing in. "I'll contact you in 3 months. Use that time to prepare. Expand Dragon Legacy as fast as you can. Train as many people as possible. Because when I contact you again, the real war begins." Then she was gone, vanishing into the darkness like she'd never existed. Kira and Garrett stood in the empty safe house processing what they'd just learned. The weight of it was crushing. "We're not ready for this," Garrett said quietly. Kira thought about the mess hall. Thought about standing there while 200 soldiers mocked her, knowing that every insult was building towards something bigger than any of them understood. Thought about 34 Dragon Crest operators who died believing their sacrifice mattered. "We're never ready," she said finally. "That's not the point. The point is we show up anyway." She touched the Dragon Crest on her back, feeling the promise written in ink and sealed with everything she'd endured. "We show up. We fight. We protect people who'll never know we exist. That's what the mark means. That's what it's always meant." Garrett placed his hand over his own fresh tattoo and nodded. Brother and sister, Dragon 47 and Dragon 48, standing together at the edge of something they couldn't fully see but had committed to anyway. Outside, the temperature dropped toward 55 below zero, the kind of cold that killed without mercy or hesitation. But they were Dragon Crest operators now, and they had work to do. Always. 6 months later. When the coalition struck, they found Dragon Crest operators already in position, in 14 countries, at 47 critical infrastructure points, ready. The attack failed, not because it wasn't sophisticated, not because the planning was flawed, but because 49 Dragon Crest operators, including 2 new recruits who'd earned their marks in the crucible of the largest defensive operation in modern history, had spent 6 months positioning themselves in exactly the right places at exactly the right times. The public never knew how close they'd come to darkness. The president knew. Congress knew. The intelligence community knew. And 49 Dragon Crest operators returned to the shadows. Their promises kept, their burdens carried in silence, as it had always been, as it would always be. Lieutenant Colonel Kira Thorne stood in her Pentagon office, still adjusting to working somewhere with carpets and windows instead of concrete and tactical displays, and looked at the memo on her desk. Dragon Legacy Program Expansion approved 247 installations across all service branches. Budget increased to $4 billion over 10 years. Presidential mandate for full implementation. On her wall hung a photograph, the only personal item in the entire office. 13 Dragon Crest operators standing in the snow outside Fort Wainwright, arms around each other's shoulders, faces showing exhaustion and pride, and the kind of bond that only forms when people face death together and survive. Her brother stood beside her in that photo. Both of them marked, both of them committed, both of them ready for whatever came next. Because that's what Dragon Crest operators did. They stood between darkness and light. They made promises they'd die to keep. They carried burdens so others wouldn't have to. And they did it in silence, in shadows, in spaces where most people would never look and could never follow. Always.